Hi, welcome to YTV in this week's segment of Everybody Has a Story. Michael Forsythe is a journalist for the New York Times based in Hong Kong, and he joins us today. Mike, thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
So there's quite a lot going on in Hong Kong right now with the democracy protests and Occupy Central. How strong do you think this movement is? This is tons of students flooding the streets of Hong Kong right now.
It really caught me by surprise. When I left about 4 or 5 days ago, it was a pretty small movement. I didn't think it would catch on this quickly, but I think the police actions, quick to use tear gas, quick to use pepper spray, infuriated a lot of people. But I'm still quite amazed at the scale of it. This is a really big deal in Hong Kong history, but also in Chinese history as well. It's quite interesting to see what the reaction of the central government in Beijing will be about this.
And how unified is the movement in Hong Kong? Because it's a lot of students, but people who are in their 30s, 40s, and so on, especially business leaders, don't seem to be as sympathetic to the cause.
Oh, absolutely. No, the movement itself is fairly well organized. In fact, I would say exceptionally well organized. But that doesn't mean that all of Hong Kong society agrees with them. It is overwhelmingly young people, also a lot of academics. There's a lot of ordinary people as well. Richard Nixon called it the silent majority. The business people, older people, which may be a majority in Hong Kong, are certainly not as enthusiastic about it or downright unenthusiastic about it. That's true. So Hong Kong itself absolutely not unified about this.
Well, you said it's very well organized. We're seeing the images that are coming out of this, the umbrellas that they're using to block the pepper spray, and the goggles. They're calling it the umbrella revolution. You can start to see people drawing parallels to Tiananmen Square, to the Tank Man. Right, what do you think of those parallels? Is there something there? Or?
Be very careful, I think, about drawing parallels with Tiananmen. Hong Kong is a very different place than Beijing is because it's obviously has a separate government system. That it has civil liberties that are not available in mainland China. So the idea of the People's Liberation Army coming in and somehow quelling this, I think most people say that's still quite remote. But the fact that people are worried about that and wondering, if Chinese soldiers are going to open fire on students in Hong Kong says a lot about the legacy of Tiananmen. But it is still quite a different movement. Things like this cannot happen on the mainland these days. In Ferguson they talked about the militarization of the police there. Well, in China you've got more than 1 million members of the People's Armed Police who are like SWAT team guys. Have a lot of great equipment, some of it from the U.S., and they're very militarized. Didn't have that back in Tiananmen. You don't see these kind of movements anymore.
What are the consequences, do you think, for these students? How severe can this get?
I don't know. As a journalist, I have to be careful about kind of prognosticating that too. It does seem like it's quite a tricky thing to get out of. The central government in Beijing seems quite unyielding. Maybe it's a matter of time. Maybe after a week or a month or 2 or 3 months, the students are going to be going back to classes. But for right now, there seems to be that the demands are escalating and getting even more firm.
Is there any chance that you see this spilling over into the mainland and inspiring protests there at all, or is it just too rigid?
No. I think maybe only a few people, maybe people in the mainland are inspired by it, but it is very difficult in the mainland now to organize at the grassroots level a non-communist party political movement. It will be crushed. It's very difficult in this day and age to do that.
With what they're protesting, which is the ability to democratically elect the leader in Hong Kong in 2017, where is the balance of power here? Because Hong Kong's GDP, at least in 1997, was 16% of China's. Now it's down to 3%. There's obviously benefits with exports and with tourism, but Is Hong Kong at a risk of losing its economic leverage?
Yeah, I don't know how much economic leverage Hong Kong has. I think China has a lot of economic leverage over Hong Kong. A lot of the buildings you see in Central that have been built since 2000 or since 1997 have been built with Chinese money. It's been a lot of the big Chinese conglomerates that have helped spur growth in Hong Kong. I don't know how much leverage they have. I think the leverage they have is the leverage of global public opinion, and the fact that China still, deep down inside, does care a little bit about its global image and doesn't want to mess things up. And also, I think the other leverage they have is if there's some heavy-handed tactics by the mainland that would hurt the Hong Kong economy, and that might kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. And what I mean by that is Hong Kong is kind of like the British Virgin Islands for China. It's an offshore entrepot for mainland China. People park their money there, people buy their houses there, people have bank accounts there. It's hard currency, it's outside of the renminbi. It's very important for a large, wealthy class of Chinese people to have a very independent, at least autonomous Hong Kong.
We talk about global public opinion, which brings me to the November conference that Barack Obama will be going to in Beijing, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. Past meetings have not been very fruitful for the United States. Do these protests change that at all?
I don't know. I don't know how they would change the dynamic. Clearly, it would be something that one would expect the United States may mention, but does that change the whole dynamics of the summit? Does it put the Chinese at a weaker position? I don't see how that plays out. And I would say that these summits, there's usually not the biggest expectations for them, but it is important for the leaders of China and the United States to get together and talk.
Well, continuing on Xi Jinping, when he took power, or at least before he took power, when everyone knew that he was going to be the successor, the news coverage in the United States was that he might be a reformer. He had spent time in the United States before when he was younger in Iowa, and that this would be the leader that would reform China. Have those predictions panned out in any way?
I think Western journalists, American journalists, both in the United States and the ones like us who were in China, I was in Beijing at the time, we do wish the best for the new Chinese leaders. And there's a lot of hope that's always riding on a new Chinese leader. And Xi Jinping was a very different leader from Hu Jintao. And, there were indications his father, Xi Jinping's father, was certainly not one of the sympathizers of the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989, from what we understand. So there was some hope there. But certainly with the tone you're seeing against dissidents in China, against whatever remains of civil society in China, the policies towards minorities, especially in Xinjiang, absolutely no tolerance even of moderate Uyghurs, in Xinjiang. Nationalism, with the territorial claims in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, problems with Vietnam. Certainly, there's a lot to not be happy about from that perspective. What you've seen on the other side, the reform's a very loaded word, but you have seen them at least pay lip service, try to move forward with economic reforms. But those are economic reforms. China's been doing economic reforms for 35 years now.
But also the anti-graft reforms that he's pushing for.
Right.
How genuine do you think his attack on corruption is? Because you've reported on some corruption and some money flow from his family that he is not addressing. He's going after people who are in power who might be a threat to him. So how genuine is this push?
I think the weight of scholars now who look at China would agree, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, that it's not just a political shakedown. It's not just a hit against his enemies, like Zhou Yongkang, the former security boss, who was responsible for building up this huge paramilitary force. That it's more broad-based than that. And I would tend to agree with that from just looking at all these shareholdings, and the breadth of this anti-corruption crackdown that he's doing. And I would take him at his word on this, that he's trying to bolster the Communist Party. And as far as his family goes, there is evidence, which we've written about at the New York Times, wrote a story in June about this, that his family is pulling out of some of the more controversial investments that they've made.
Well, there's also a huge crackdown, as you mentioned, on foreign journalists. They've implemented new restrictions on press credentials and visas. You are reporting on things that do not make you the favorite journalist of the Chinese government, especially the story you wrote in June. Have you been afraid to go back in any way?
Right. Well, I can't go back. I can't go back unless I get a visa. So I've applied a couple times, haven't gotten one. But I haven't applied for a tourist visa. I suppose at some time I could do that. I wouldn't be afraid to go back. I think somebody said, China is not Russia yet. It's not at the point where journalists are routinely put in life-threatening situations. There's far more dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. But I'm definitely not getting Christmas cards from the Communist Party. And they haven't personally gone after me. They usually go after the institution. So the New York Times and Bloomberg have not received new visas for new reporters in over 2 years, ever since those stories came out in 2012.
So how exactly do you go about cultivating sources for your stories if you are completely shut out?
Hong Kong is a great place because a lot of people pass through Hong Kong. A lot of Chinese people, especially the upper strata of society, a lot of these princelings, a lot of people who know princelings, financiers, they're always in Hong Kong. And in fact, it's a lot easier to talk to them in Hong Kong than it is in other places. So I have good sources, and some of them come down to Hong Kong. And I can talk to them there, which is really great. And in addition to that, I work in cooperation with the New York Times reporters who are still in mainland China. So we just team up and do stories together, and that's how it does. There's no pattern to it. There's kind of a methodology, but it's evolving, on how to do these stories. But it works. It's not easy. I'd love to go, knock on those doors in Beijing myself. But I can always, count on my colleagues to do that, and sometimes better than I would do it.
Well, we always end our interviews with a very brief speed round of just like quick, fun questions. So we've got two ones right here. First is, if you could report in any other country, where would you be based?
Oh, that's a really good question. This is a really cop-out answer, but I'm going to tell you, I was a reporter in the U.S. for a long time, in Washington, and I do enjoy reporting in Washington. That said, India is also a fabulous story, and I love Indian culture. And it's just such a massive scale. It's like a massive scale, China scale country, but it's also a democracy with fabulous civil society, fabulous religions. It's just a rich culture. So India also, I think, would be a fabulous place to be a reporter.
And the last one, if someone could play you in a Woodward Bernstein style journalistic thriller, who would you have play you in the movie?
That's a no-brainer. Matt Damon, definitely.
All right.
Yeah, you can see the resemblance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Got a little bit of Jason Bourne in you.
Absolutely.
Michael Forsythe, thanks so much for joining us. And as always, thank you for joining us for YTV. I'm Cody Pomeranz, and this has been Everybody Has a Story. See you next time.